Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're coming from. Today, Trevor and I will be talking about the Internet Security Report, the quarterly one for Q2 of 2022. Before we dive in, I'm Corey Nachreiner. As you heard, I'm the Chief Security Officer, previous CTO of WatchGuard Technologies. And among other things, I manage the Threat Lab, which includes a manager you hear in a second. But with me today is one of our security operation analysts, Trevor Collins. Why don't you introduce yourself, Trevor?
Hi, I'm Trevor Collins. I am a security analyst here at WatchGuard. I write the report. I provide a lot of data for our quarterly reports as well, among other tasks that I have at the Threat Lab.
And besides us, many people actually wrote this report. Mark is a constant writer in the report along with myself. Me and him actually started it. As you can see, he's both the manager of our SOC, but also the director of security operations. And then we have many other analysts besides Trevor, like John Schilling, Ryan Estes, and Josh Stufenberg, who also help us write the report. So kudos to them. So what is our agenda for today? Well, we're basically going to cover this report, and it has various sections. We're going to start with the Firebox feed, which we'll talk about in a second. Trevor will tell you exactly what that's made up of. But at a high level, this is information from our network security product. So how network-based malware is delivered. We'll talk about different types of malware we saw. We also talk about what our intrusion prevention service saw as far as new network attacks, as well as big domains that we block through our DNS firewall called DNS Watch. Then we have an endpoint section because WatchGuard also sells WatchGuard EPDR. We got through an acquisition of Panda Security. This will talk about malware. Oops, it looks like I have a mess up in my slide, but this will talk about malware from the endpoint section. And this month we actually talk about script-based malware. There's a story of the month that's on Phobina. I'll chat about what that is for a second, but we'll actually refer to the report for most of that. But throughout this isn't just to talk about how the threats are changing, but more importantly, how to talk about what kind of defense strategies you should put in place to handle the threats we see currently in the wild. So throughout the whole talk, we'll have different security tips that can help you defend against what we've seen. But with that said, let's get to our network security threat intelligence we saw in Q2 with the Firebox feed. Sorry, you can tell I say Firefox a lot too. And with that, I'll hand it off to Trevor for a second to describe what the Firebox feed monitors.
Thanks, Corey. So the Firebox feed is an anonymized opt-in feed that we have. So it takes the information that we get from the Fireboxes as they catch or as they detect different malware, different IPS. It also, besides that, has an APT blocker and DNS Watch. Now, and it sends all those reports to us where we're able to gather that information and create a overall view of what type of attacks we see in the world. So each of these services act a little bit differently. The GAV is a signature-based service that quickly identifies malware based off of signatures. So it can create like a hash, if you're familiar with that, or even parts of the malware that'll create a hash that is identified as malware.
Basically, Trevor, it sounds like gateway antivirus. You know, if a threat analyst has seen malware before, we can find a unique pattern in it, and that is the signature. And so the good thing is it can quickly catch malware we already know about, but until you have that signature, it might not catch anything.
Correct. And so it's really good at catching the patterns that we know about. But a lot of the malware that we see today is actually brand new malware that don't have previous patterns. So you need something more advanced, such as APT blocker. APT blocker will take the malware and actually put it into a sandbox, an advanced sandbox that will detect the true intent of the malware. So if there's malware that has some type of time bomb where it will only activate at a certain time, or downloads other malware, but we'll be able to identify this type of
And
malware.
basically, the sandbox, Trevor, it's like it's emulating a Windows system. It's emulating the same kind of system that a real client, that your victim might have getting the malware. And that includes having Office programs, having Adobe Acrobat. And because of that, it can pay attention to everything the suspicious file, maybe a malware, might do on a real system. That's why we call it a sandbox.
Absolutely, and it's not just your regular VM sandbox that you have on your computer. It's actually configured so that it can fool the malware into thinking that it's a real machine, because a lot of malware have anti-sandbox, anti-sandbox
Yeah.
code in there to identify that, and then it'll just not execute. But this is actually more advanced than that. So
we call it full system code emulation. And it's like Trevor gave you one example of a time bomb. Another one is malware might look for mouse movement because it doesn't want to be on a research machine. It wants to be on a machine with a human. So the tricks we can do with the full system code emulation is when we see something asking for mouse movement, we can automatically send it what it's looking for in reply so that it keeps executing whatever it's going to execute.
Yes, it's a pretty interesting system that they have set up there, actually, when you start looking into it. So our next service that we have is IPS. That is a signature-based network detection. It identifies any type of network attacks, and then our last service that we have here for the Firebox feed, you obviously have other services, but is DNS Watch. DNS Watch is based on DNS filtering for the domain. So any type of DNS request that is being sent out from the computer, either via the application or whatever means, is going to get inspected and making sure that those domains are not malicious domains or compromised or phishing domains, anything like that. So that's
basically every time any user clicks on a domain or a URL of any sort, it's going to try to ask for the IP address associated using DNS. And that's when we take over as the DNS service. And some of the categories we have are like compromised sites, which are legitimate sites that are being hacked, malware distributing sites, phishing. And if we see the domain your user is trying to go to is one of those bad ones you want to block, we simply, sinkhole it, which means give it a false reply to a safe site, letting them know they almost went to a bad place. I'm going to kind of just share the high level, real quick analysis of Q2 malware trends, and then Trevor's going to dive into detail about malware. I'm not going to read every single one of these stats. I'm going to give you some additional ones, but basically you can see we have about 77,000 reporting fireboxes. There's hundreds of thousands of more out there, something like almost 500,000, but these are the ones that have opted in to sharing this threat intelligence data with us. By the way, one thing you can do if you're a listener that actually is a Firebox customer, opting into this information being sent to us really helps us not only identify threats, but improve products. But some of the big highlights are malware and network attacks are down. You can see there are big numbers for both gateway antivirus and APT blocker malware, but overall, the volume of malware prevented in Q2 compared to Q1, it dropped 15.7%. So despite all of those detections, it is down a bit. Since I'm talking about highlights, I will mention we'll get to the endpoint malware detection, but interestingly, often endpoint malware continues to rise. Maybe attackers are targeting users at home, not at the network where the network appliance is, but endpoint malware detection also dropped about 20% this quarter. Now, on the flip side of this, you see some stats at the bottom. I'm going to let Trevor explain those in a little more detail later. But one of the big takeaways is despite malware being down, we found that 81% of malware is hiding behind encryption. A lot of malware is delivered via TLS nowadays. That's the type of encryption used by secure websites, HTTPS sites. And when we look at boxes that actually enable that service, 81% of the malware arrives that way. And the takeaway there, as you'll find out later, is you really need to scan that encrypted traffic or you're missing a lot. But Trevor will talk a little bit more about that and also what we call our 0-day malware statistic. Zero-day malware is not a zero-day vulnerability. Rather, it's the malware that evades signature-based detection. And we found in Q2 over half, 53% evaded signature protection. I'll get to network attacks later, but also know network volume dropped about 10% in Q2 over Q1 as well, with fireboxes blocking about 55 network attacks per firebox on average. So those are some overall trends. I've mixed more than just malware there, but for a deeper look at malware, I'm going to hand it off to Trevor for the next 15, 20 minutes or so.
Thanks, Corey. So what we'll do at first is take a look at the top malwares, that we see on Q2. So this is the top 10 gateway antivirus malware. So this is a GAV malware that is caught, that is detected. And these samples here are the ones that we see just overall volume. So these are actually all we have seen before. We can see, there's one that is back in 2000 that we last saw 2019, the coin miner. And this one is, but in general, for the top 10, I wanted to make a note of this, is that we are often seeing a lot of the same types of malware. And in this case here, just these top 10 malware samples are more than half of the total malware that we see. So
the top 10 accounts for like almost just under 60% of everything, basically, right, Trev?
Right. So if you have an idea about kind of what these threats do, then that would be the next step, in understanding what type of malware threats are out there and how to prevent 60% of the malware to infecting your network.
Trevor, I think you're going to highlight some, maybe not these ones, but some malware later. But just to quickly go over for folks that haven't been on the other webinars, the two CVs, the one for 2018 and 2017, those are both like Office related, Word and Excel related vulnerabilities. So that means malware that's coming as a malicious spreadsheet or Office document. So you'll hear with Folina later that malware arriving as Office files is a trend in network-based attacks. So to what Trevor just said, how do you protect yourself? Consider how to handle document-based malware. One small highlight is Emotet made a comeback. It really made a comeback. I think we first saw it in Q4 of last year, right, Trevor? And quite a bit in Q1. Yeah, Q1 for sure. Yep. It's dropping, so it's not quite as high, but you can see a Trojan that spreads Emotet there too. So the resurgence continues. I think Trevor would agree it's not as high levels as it was in Q1. But it is still around, despite the fact that authorities took down the command and control for one variant of Emotet a while back. And the Moon we've been seeing repeatedly, and I just to point out, that's IoT malware. It's malware that's targeting Linux-based IoT devices, right, Trev?
Correct. Yeah, the Moon is kind of a suite of malware that is meant to exploit different IoT devices. And the just going back to the Abracadabra malware for Emotet, is we're seeing most of it is targeting, it's basically packaged with Emotet or downloading Emotet, but there is also a significant portion of the malware that's just other type of Win code injection malware to download other different type of botnets and code. And so these are all the top 10 in volume malware. So actually, I think we're about ready for the poll there.
Yeah, so we're going to move to another type of malware, but before we do, we have a quick poll question for you. The question is, do you use Firebox or other network SSL TLS deep packet inspection capabilities? So I mentioned before, one of the takeaways this year, we'll learn more about in a second, is 81% of malware uses encrypted connections to come through. And this is typically TLS with web inspection. Fireboxes and other network security devices often have the capability to decrypt this at the network device and inspect it for you. So hopefully you can see the results. The good news is about a little under half of you say you're using it. As you'll learn in a second, that is really one of the big takeaways we highly recommend. Some of you plan to get to it. Some of you just haven't yet. And a small percentage of you, but a percentage, 7% don't because it's too disruptive. The one thing we'll talk about when we get to defense is turning on HTTPS inspection. It works most of the time, but there's certain clients, maybe not websites, but clients that might have a PIN certificate. And then there are some domains that get really strict with functionality that will pin a certificate that might not work through this. So we have exceptions for that. There's ways to still get it set up, but that's what we talk about with disruptive. And again, for the folks that are wondering what it is, hopefully you understand that basically it's just a feature you can turn on. In fact, a free feature on the Firebox. You do have to do some certificate setup either on the Firebox itself with your domain certificate, your CA signing certificate that you might have through Microsoft Active Directory, or you have to send certificates to your clients. But once you do this, you can then have the Firebox inspect even encrypted traffic to scan for malware and scan for IPS, and it's a very good thing to do. So thank you for sharing that. And the reason we asked is hopefully, back to the presentation, we're now getting to the top encrypted malware of the quarter, Trevor.
Yes. So and one thing I did notice on the poll there, just a comment on that, was that while the results of this don't actually match the results that we see in our reporting data. So, and I think we find that only around 20%, but around about 1 in 5, depending on what quarter we are inspecting this, are actually inspecting encrypted traffic. And I think that probably those who are watching this webinar are the ones who are more security minded and know the importance of inspecting this traffic. So I'm happy to see that there are at least half that, or almost half that, have this type of encryption enabled or inspection enabled. Unfortunately, it's in our reporting data, we see somewhere close to 1 in 5 only have this enabled. So let's talk about.
By the way, just since you're talking about, this is unrelated, but I did notice one question that I might just get rid of quickly, that someone asked how many people actually opt into our feed. This isn't encrypting traffic, but opt into sharing information. And just to let you know, I think the rough statistic is about 13% of active boxes. We probably have many more fireboxes out there that aren't active too, but of the ones that have active support, probably that 77,000 is maybe 13 to 15%.
Excellent, and it's and great. That's good to know. The for the next slide here, we're top encrypted malware. This is why we were asking about on the poll, because for those who don't have inspection of the encrypted malware, then this is a type of malware that you will be missing. We have some familiarities in the Abracadabra, the Emotet malware that's being shared and detected. There's different scripts. The generic FCA script, we'll talk a little bit more and we go into detail on the report, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in the webinar. And we see so we'll see a lot of the similar categories. We do tend to see a lot more email droppers in the encrypted malware, just simply because people are inspecting the encryption on SMTP proxies, which is going to catch type of email. And I do find that they tend to, those who are inspecting encrypted traffic over SMTP proxy tend to be higher than versus like a HTTPS proxy.
And I would assume it's just a little easier to set up because you only have you only interact with certain mail servers, whereas, as I mentioned before, some websites might pin certificates. So do you agree, Trevor?
Yes, it
Just
is
a
a
little
little
easier to
bit
set up with
easier.
SMTP. Yeah.
It's a little bit easier because you control the internal server oftentimes, and whereas when you're setting up something for HTTPS, you have to set up a little bit kind of a miniature certificate authority configuration for that. Although it is pretty easy to do as well.
Once you know how to do it, it's not bad at all.
Yeah. And so that's the encrypted malware. Let's take a look at the next slide at the widespread malware. So this type of malware we look at differently. Instead of looking at the total volume of malware, what we look at here is the malware that has hit the most fireboxes. So we have the top 5 malware that has hit the most fireboxes around the world, and then we separate it. And we see how many fireboxes has each country seen this malware. So we can see for the CVE 2018, which is a Word document malware or an Office malware, we see Germany, German fireboxes in Germany have seen 43%. 43%, or to put it another way, 43% of the malware of fireboxes have seen that malware in Germany. We do the same thing for each region, EMEA, APAC, and Americas. And so
to some extent, I find this more relevant to most people than our volume, our top 10, because as Trevor mentioned, our top 10, theoretically, one of the number one threats could theoretically only be hitting one box thousands and thousands of times, or maybe it's all in one region, but over and over and over to lots of boxes. Whereas widespread, these are the threads that are really touching the most customers out there because they're touching the most fireboxes. So again, if you're doing high level, Trevor, would you say, I think the 2 CVEs and the RTF one, even though it's an RTF-based file, I believe it was Office. So these are all document-based malware. So things that would arrive as Word documents, Excel spreadsheets.
yes,
you can talk about more. Yeah, go ahead.
It is somewhat unusual to see the widespread malware have 2 non-document malware samples on this list.
It's actually pretty common that document-based are the common ones. So that is a general good takeaway for the listeners out there, is watch out for those documents.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, the documents are going to be the most widespread malware. And even on here, you can see, the top malware sample that we see is the most widespread. So, but again, we see the abracadabra spreading the Emotet. And we can see that over half of the fireboxes in Japan have seen that particular malware family. So
I do think it's interesting that Japan was a target. Was it last quarter too? Japan is seeing such a huge amount of the Emotet resurgence.
Absolutely. And the fact that it's number 2 on the list for the top widespread malware, while we do see it has gone down from Q1, it's still significant in Q2 as well. And we can also see it, it's also hitting Indonesia and Italy and other countries as well. We can only see the top 3 on this list here, but obviously it's hitting other places.
I think the remaining percentage at the bottom, well, I guess maybe not, but keep going, Trevor, sorry.
Sure. So, and then the Trojan NSIX spy is, if I recall correctly, is a type of installation malware that is used for installing other malware. We can see, but going back to the countries that we are seeing being targeted, there's a lot of times there's some overlap. A lot of times we'll see Germany and Greece, Hong Kong, Turkey. Those are all, if you've looked previous reports and previous quarters, then those are all common countries that seem to be targeted. I don't have an explanation as to why those are being targeted, but we do see certain areas targeted for one reason or another.
Yeah, I'd say the only thing missing from the list that we sometimes see hidden regional is UK too, but Germany, Greece, Turkey always seem to be there. USA's countries, states sometimes, but UK is one that didn't show up too much this quarter, but it's been there in the past.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's where
Yeah.
is UK? I'm sure you'll be back
Maybe they're
next
having
quarter.
a lucky malware break.
Right.
They were all gone. Oh, wait, that's Q2. It's not August yet.
There you go.
Gonna say they're all on vacation.
So let's take a look at the malware highlights. One of the we take a look at different samples that look interesting to us, look interesting to me actually, and I'll write about them and understand exactly what these types of malware samples are doing. The first one that we are looking at, which I found, is the Boxster malware. This one, as I looked into it, originally starts as and it's created by a group called Gothic Panda. This group is also APT3 and is related to the Chinese Ministry of State Security. So this is a the APT malware that we detected. Now,
Or state-sponsored, put another way, right? Gothic Panda is one of the Chinese state-sponsored actors.
correct, correct. And so this malware that we're starting to see being spread, uh, there is also a possibility because of the code reuse. You know, like we were talking about, there's different sections of the malware can have different signatures, and so based on then there's often a lot of times where the malware is shared between different groups, and it appears that well, originally this was created by the Gothic Panda, is also being used now to spread the password stealer called Redline. So this is a password stealer that will install on the victim's computer, start stealing passwords from Chrome and Explorer. Usually it tries to look for some type of a Bitcoin key. And so just covering the last point on the Gothic Panda, we also see it using resolving domains. So what I mean by that is that if there's one domain, it has some type of command and control infrastructure that it accesses to download more malware or to update its own malware. But a lot of times where the infrastructure ISPs will catch on to this type of the malware infrastructure and will start shutting down those domains. Well, the Boxster malware is going to go take a look at list of domains and update to the next domain name.
Well, I was just gonna add a few things that I was just going to say. I find it interesting that you talked about how Gothic Panda, that this malware is known to be related to Gothic Panda, but it could also be used by criminals. One thing that's interesting about state-sponsored attackers, is they really often use the same tools as other undergrounds. We've seen them using payloads from Metasploit, or what can I think of the other one, Cobalt Strike. We've seen them use things like PowerSploit, which is a public, PowerShell-based malware library, or malicious feature library. And so it's interesting how this could be the state-sponsored actor, because they have been seen to use this particular Boxster malware before, but it could be commercial. For the revolving domains, the one thing with things like DNS Watch, but also if you go through companies like Domain Tools, a lot of the people that pay attention to domain registration, what they do is revolving domains. Sometimes these threat actors will register hundreds of domains at a time that sometimes seem very semi-random. Domains are just a bunch of letters, but then they'll sit on them. So they're registered but inactive. And organizations like Domain Tools follows that, keeps the history of it, and has threat intelligence because, as Trevor said, the way they use these hundreds of registered domains is when good guys catch up on one, they just switch it out with a different domain. But if you have the threat intelligence of domains that are registered, and sometimes companies like Domain Tools can see indicators of the registration that suggest it's by a known bad actor, they're able to sometimes anonymize registration nowadays, but there's enough information in there that you can tell if it's a bad actor in some cases, that you can actually preemptively sometimes block some of these inactive domains that might become the new revolving one eventually. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to add those few things. I
Yes.
think it's very interesting that the criminal attackers, the only way we can find state-sponsored ones is the tactics, techniques, and procedures, the TTPs they use. But so often, if you're using the same tools, that might look like the same TTP. So it can be mistaken as state-sponsored actors and normal criminal ones.
And we're going to talk about layer defense, later on. But on this, you bring up a good point about how the DNS is. We want to catch those types of domain name requests, and this is where DNS Watch also comes into play to help protect the networks from downloading more malware and having it updated to try to bypass anti-malware. And so you have the GAV and the DNS working to block this type of malware sample. So on to our next sample that we found here. I'll go really quick. The generic FCA. We found this sample here targeted a popular cloud service in Germany called IONOS. And so this is essentially targeting tech companies and asking for, we have some good pictures in the report, but it is an email that is asking for credentials for that user's account. And so if you have an account, then you might be motivated based on the email or tricked by the email to enter your credentials. But the thing is once you enter in your credentials, you're going to, you would likely get a notification, get an MFA notification where, on your phone or wherever you have your two-factor authentication set up. And then because it's the server that is you're going to be sent to their own service. And so there's proxied.
You're being phished essentially, right, Trevor?
You're being phished. And so but then it's being proxied and being sent out. So you still get that MFA notification, but
since some malware is running local on your, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, the connection that is being made is between you and the malicious server, and then between the malicious server and the real domain, the real IONOS domain. And so when you're getting that notification, it is that connection between the malicious server and the real IONOS domain. So then
essentially they're just forwarding everything to the real one. And so you are eventually getting to the real site, and the MFA notification is a real acceptance, right, Trevor? But because you're being, technically they call this adversary in the middle attack. Microsoft has seen a lot of these recently, although maybe not with this particular script, but you're being phished, but you're being forwarded to the real site after the adversary on the middle part. So once you properly authenticate to the real site, the bad actor is possibly getting your credentials and definitely getting what's called your session token, so they can log on with you.
And one other note that I found on this particular malware was that it had an interesting top-level domain, .su. For those who are familiar, this should ring a few alarm bells, and that's because the SU is a kind of defunct top-level domain that is based on the Soviet Union. So obviously that's dissolved, and nobody should be using it. But there's what ends up happening is a lot of malware actors take over that domain use because it's still out there, and they use that for malicious websites. So on the next sample that we took a look at was this Jenk malware. And it is essentially a few different malware. In the particular sample that we downloaded, it is downloading the OSCE stealer, which is similar to the Redline password stealer. However, it's a different malware sample and a separate code. It does the same thing though. It downloads passwords from Chrome, from your Bitcoin wallets, from anywhere else that is going to contain the passwords. It also contains a Lockybot for its persistence, and then to use the victim's computer for whatever they feel like, to attack other targets. And this, just like any type of botnet, it reports to the command and control. So that's some of the malware samples. I would encourage you to take a look at the report for a little bit more details on that. We did get some pictures about kind of what you see, some of the emails to look out for on how to identify these malware. And so we'll take a look at the 0-day. Now, like Corey previously mentioned, the 0-day malware is malware detections that we see for the very first time. So these are caught by APT blocker. And GAV, which is based on the signatures and patterns, have not seen this pattern or signature previously. So we've split these further on the 0-day malware into two different categories. One is all devices that are blocking using APT blocker. And we see here, when take a look at all devices that using that, 53%, just over 53% of the malware is 0-day. So if you're not using APT blocker, you're missing most of the malware. If you take a look at the devices
if we pause there, Trevor, hopefully you can hear me on the new mic. Another way to look at that is if you're a Firebox customer, obviously you're not using APT blocker if you missed that. But I would say this probably relates to other types of anti-malware products out there too. Many have signature-based techniques and some have behavioral-based techniques. So if you're not using like behavioral-based malware detection, that sandbox we talked about, or something like machine learning-based malware protection, we have something called Intelligent AV, and other products have it too. So you can, while this is based on our product data, we believe that the ratio is probably similar for any other anti-malware vendor that has both legacy signature-based detection, but the more proactive ones we talked about as well.
Yeah, so you sound much better, Corey. So that's, I think the new mic worked. And so we'll take a look at the, so for the malware, we also take a look and separate that for the APT blocker detections. We also separate that into devices that are scanning HTTPS traffic. So when we take a look at this, we actually see a significant difference in where malware that was detected as 0-day malware over an HTTPS inspection, where it's inspecting the TLS traffic, over 80% of that malware is APT malware that is, or 0-day malware that is caught on that HTTPS traffic, and only 20%, just under 20%.
Said another way, Trevor, while we had 81% of malware arrive over TLS, this is looking at how much of the malware ratio is 0-day in encrypted traffic. So this is pointing out that basically at the end of the day, the attackers that take the extra time to make sure that their malware distribution is encrypted as an evasion technique, because they know it gets past people that don't scan that, they're also more likely to use malware that gets past signature detection, because that ratio goes up from 53 to 80% when it's in encrypted traffic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is essentially showing that you really need some type of zero-day malware detection, and you also need to inspect the TLS traffic in HTTPS. So for now, let's take a look at the malware detections by region. What we do here is we take all the fireboxes and we average them out for the number of detections in each region. And so we can see that EMEA consistently still sees the most amount of malware. In fact, more malware than APAC and Americas combined. At APAC, we see a little bit more malware than Americas, although Americas and APAC will change depending on which quarter you look at. And 27% almost for APAC and a little over 20% for the Americas.
And I just want to make clear what Trevor said at the beginning, just so you understand that by pure volume, the percentage, like if we looked at volume, Americas might be way higher than that. But what we're doing is to make it fair, we're accounting for how many fireboxes are in each region, like he said. So this is weighted to be more realistic, like per firebox in region, EMEA sees the lion's share over Americas. Well, thank you, Trevor. With that, we're going to switch to Q2 network attacks. At the highest level, network attacks are things that our intrusion prevention service catches. And realize the intrusion prevention service catches a lot, basically any software-based exploit that happens over the network. People often think about servers when they think about IPS, things like Exchange or Apache or flaws on servers. But you can't forget that actually the majority of these are client-based attacks, like drive-by downloads, where maybe there's a flaw in your browser, Chrome, Internet Explorer, Edge, whatever. And so IPS also does catch attacks of clients going to web servers out there or web services out there. So it's not just incoming service-based attacks. As I mentioned in the highlights, we saw a huge surge of network attacks happening at the end of last year, but since then, it's declined. So the pure volume of IPS attacks, as you can see, was under 4 million this year. As I mentioned, it's about a 10% decline, 9.9% to be exact. And that's about 55 attacks per firebox compared to last quarter, which was probably closer to 70 attacks per firebox. Looking at the top 10, this is top 10 by volume. So these are the most common exploits we see being leveraged over the network. And this list does not change much. We see a lot of repeated attacks on our top 10. Sometimes we dig deeper to find interesting ones. There are some newish ones on this list though. While it sounds similar to all the others, that web directory traversal number 7 is actually a new web directory traversal flaw. I'll talk about it in a little more detail in a second. Things like Apache Log4j. You remember that vulnerability came out at the end of last year, the Log4j2 vulnerabilities that were pretty significant. We're still seeing that being exploited in volume. The reason we believe we see most of these attacks, and of course there's a couple of Log4js on this list, but the reason we believe we see repeats is we think a lot of this is automated activity. Botnets out there have something called a mass scan, where they will just scan for open ports on the internet and automatically try a library of vulnerabilities for those ports so they can account for it. It can also be accounted for by legitimate pen testing, where essentially external vulnerability scans look very similar to what a botnet would do. But I'm not going to cover every single one of these flaws in detail, but the themes I will mention is first, notice a lot of these, pretty much all of these are web-based attacks, except for the second one, which is an Office document attack. But all the rest are kind of web-based attacks, often targeting a web client that is visiting a site and or a server itself. Some of the big ones, the one I mentioned, Web Directory Traversal number 7, was interesting to us because it's a generic detection for Web Directory Traversal. If you don't know what that is, when you have a website, the way the website is configured is it has to get the files on your server to display the web pages that are on that server, but web servers are supposed to restrict to just the web root files, just the files you want a visitor to see. A web directory traversal vulnerability is when there's some flaw in the software that allows the bad actor to escape the normal web root and get to other files on the file system. They might be able to get to system files and grab your hash file, which, you know, it's a shadow file on a Linux machine, or I forget, the SAM file and System32 on Windows, and they can crack those hashes. But then others allow for code execution. Sometimes there's directories where if you place an executable, it will have privilege to actually execute too. So this Web Directory Traversal 7 is one of many Web Directory Traversal signatures we have, but this one is interesting, and it's specifically designed to catch a Web Directory Traversal flaw in SpecView 2.5. And if you've never heard of SpecView, don't feel bad, neither have I. I don't run an industrial control system or something that uses SCADA software. SCADA stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. It's basically the human interface to some operational technology that's in a plant or a manufacturing thing, like a centrifuge would be reporting information back to SCADA to tell it how the centrifuge is performing. So SpecView is the kind of software that, you know, a manufacturing or industrial control or critical system might use. So that to us was a big deal. It's one of the first times we've seen a SCADA flaw show up in our top 10 by volume IPS list. It is an older vulnerability, 2012, but in this case, that might not be a big deal because unfortunately, unlike commercial software like Windows, which gets updated every month, sometimes this industrial control operations technology does not get updated quite as often. Other than that, there were a number of other web directory traversal signatures, as we see every quarter, but one other new one is the one at the bottom, 27, which has to do with Zoho Manage Engine. So it's a central desktop management engine for Zoho products, but also could be related to Oracle Application Testing Suite's Web Management UI or Trend Micro's Control Manager. So the two high-level takeaways I'm trying to point out here is first, that SCADA issue, SpecView, was via a web administrative interface, and these other directory traversal flaws, 27, all three of those different applications, the flaw was in the web administrative interface. So all of these web traversal flaws, or the two I mentioned at least, are looking for management interfaces that are exposed online. And we'll get into our takeaways later, but that's obviously not something you want to do. You don't want to expose an admin management interface to the whole internet. So that's kind of the highlights of the top 10 network attacks. In the report, we also have the most widespread IPS attacks, which I'm not going to go into detail. You should check out the report, but there's an interesting Apache Struts vulnerability that made it high on that list. Regionally, as you can see, most of the attacks, when we do that firebox weighting Trevor talked about, almost over half, you know, almost 60% of the attacks are in the Asia Pacific, which is kind of interesting. Meanwhile, in this case, for network attacks, EMEA, the European, Middle East, and Africa remain on the bottom. So I'm going to go through this one rather quickly for time's sake so we can get to some questions and some tips. But the last service we talk about in the Firebox feed is DNS Watch. As mentioned, this monitors for when your users accidentally do click on malicious links. When they do the DNS lookup, if it's bad, we can sinkhole them. The three types of different things that we show in the report for DNS Watch, there's a lot of categories, but first we talk about things like the compromised site category. And that's basically legitimate sites that have been compromised. You can see the top 10 here. The one on the bottom, I believe, leancoding Co was a legitimate domain that was previously associated with malicious content, meaning it probably got hijacked to spread it, but has since been parked or put on sale. So it doesn't exist anymore, but because it was previously associated with malware and now isn't a real site, we still leave it on our compromised site list. So that's one example there. The malware list is basically either command and control servers that malware reports to, and or malware distribution servers, which are servers that maybe the bots or Trojans Trevor talks about that grab additional payloads. It's where they go to grab them. A couple examples from this list, Proftest. This is a domain that's been in our list for over 4 years. It's been known to be a command and control or C2 infrastructure for many types of malware out there. So it's probably hosted at some bulletproof hosting domain to help support malware as a command and control infrastructure. The ones that have to do with Brian Krebs and either, sexual dysfunction or other sexual things. If you know Brian Krebs, he's a well-known security journalist. Malware attackers don't like him because he obviously reports and does scoops on a lot of their things. But these are two domains that aren't Krebs-related domains, but they're actually hosting HabitsRat, which is a remote access Trojan that affects Windows and Linux machines. So I think that's threat actors' way of joking by hosting some of their malware. It's something that's named after Brian Krebs. And finally, the phishing domain. Oh, go ahead, Trevor.
That's
sorry.
Pretty often. Just wanted to say that's pretty often what we'll see. We'll see that it'll be hidden in some type of response, or it'll be hidden in some type of domain, and it'll just be like some dig at a random security pen tester like Brian Krebs or anybody else. That is a pen tester. You're going to get attacked by these malicious authors. So sometimes it's a little, it's a little bit joking, but they're obviously not.
You will be a target. They have sent drugs to his house before.
Yeah.
So the last domain phishing, self-explanatory, but to give you a couple examples, you notice there's two SharePoint sites, KeyRock and ucore-my. SharePoint, totally legitimate domain, as you know, but customers, when you create a SharePoint account, you can actually create a subdomain that's customized to you. And because of that, bad guys love it. They love it because SharePoint looks legitimate because it is, but some of the subdomains there can host things like phishing campaigns, which is what KeyRock and ucore did host. And then another one, fprogcorp.com, you see on that list. Just point that out because that's a phishing domain that's hosting to basic Office 365 phishing. So it hosts a fake site that looks very much like the same login you'd get on for Office 365. So just some examples of our DNS, but for time's sake, we're going to go really quickly. Next poll question. So this one, since we're about to get the tips, the question is, let me see if the poll is launching okay. Do you segment your internal network by trust level or use the zero trust security paradigm? So is your internal network flat, or do you have different network segments with different protections that only certain users can access for your higher trust things? And the answers are you do both, or you just segment internally, but maybe don't have user-based zero trust policies, or maybe you just use zero trust policies. As you can see, a lot of you do both, which is good, 20%, but most of you at least segment your internal network. I would suspect that overall a few less of you are actually at zero trust yet, which by the way is very common. Zero trust, by the way, I put them together because zero trust is having user-based least privilege principle, making sure even your internal users have the least access to only the sources they need to do their work, nothing more, nothing less. If you have a flat network, your accountant might be able to get to a source code server, even though there's no reason for your accountant to do that. Zero trust means you've limited this quite a bit in a user-based way. Segmenting can also help because you may not have zero trust policies, but if you have the source code server in a network that's not on the same network the accountant has, that protects you. So it looks like a lot of you are segmenting, which is excellent. And some of you have zero trust, but I do think it's taking the industry a little longer to get to zero trust. But the reason we asked that is, Trevor, just to remind you, let's go through tips quick because we only have a few minutes. My first tip is to secure SCADA. And the reason we point this out is because obviously we saw a SCADA-based attack. If you're industrial controller manufacturing, you need to secure those operational networks. Those networks should not be anywhere near the internet. And that's where things like network segmentation come in. The air gap has probably gone away in a lot of industrial control systems. You know, things like energy have found the value of connecting to different plants for things like smart grid and stuff like that. But you still, even if you don't have the air gap, you need to segment those networks. And while I'm talking about SCADA here, this tip applies to any business too, when you just separate it by trust instead of your operational technology. So if you have the things that you have highly confidential in your network, how many of your employees really need to access them? How many employees beyond finance and executive need to access your finance servers, for instance, besides engineering, who should access source code? So even though we have this tip specified at SCADA, I would still consider segmenting any trusted network and separating it from the normal employees at your organization. Why don't you take the next one, Trevor?
Thanks, Troy. So we're talking specifically about layered anti-malware. Now, in any security system, you're going to want a layered security. That's why we recommend to have the zero trust. That's why we recommend to separate. And so, but when we're specifically for anti-malware, there's a couple of different systems that we're talking about. It's a gateway antivirus malware. It's our IAV malware, our APT blocker. All those are going to be to detect and a series of services that are able to detect different types of malware. And then we're going to, when we're talking about even further down, just like the previous malware sample we discussed, where it was able to be detected by the GAV, but then if it were to morph into something else based and connect to its command and control center domains, then you want something like DNSWatch to block that. Then you're able to just completely nerf it until you're able to remove it from your system. Then further on, you want to have your endpoint detection and response installed on each of your host computers. This is not just so you have your network perimeter, and then you also have for the Firebox, and then you also have your endpoint detection response on each of the host machines and any internal servers that you have. And this is going to be doing a lot of the same.
Now, obviously, in remote work, you may not have your Firebox, so the endpoint EPDR becomes even more important there.
Absolutely, and if you're doing the remote work, you obviously another layer of defense that you're doing, since you brought it up, is you want to have a VPN connection between your remote work computer and your work servers, so that you're not not everybody can access your internal networks from the outside.
Cool. Final Firebox feed tip is to protect your management interfaces. I kind of covered this when we were talking about the IPS signatures. A lot of those web traversal attacks, directory traversal, the SCADA ones, but also the ones to Trend Micro and Zoho Manage Engine, were all web administrative interfaces. You might want to remotely administer those, but you don't want to show those to the entire internet. So what you should do is either put those web management interfaces behind a VPN like Trevor talked about, which, by the way, is the only way I would personally do it. But if you do need to expose them by public IP, you need to have a very limited access control list with specific IPs or maybe dynamic domains that can access them. Don't put web administrative interfaces on the internet. Because we're technically over, I'm going to really speed up here, but do know our report also covers a ton of stuff about endpoint-based malware. So what we're seeing on the endpoint rather than the network. One of the things we monitor monitor is how malware is delivered. What is the delivery vector? Some options are Office documents, browser-based exploits in Edge, Chrome, IE, etc. Just malicious Windows files. Piracy, AutoKMS is a system used basically to get past the Windows licensing, or PDF files. And finally, scripts. Malicious scripts like JavaScript or PowerScript. As you can see, the big takeaway for the report is 87% of endpoint-based malware starts as a malicious script. A huge portion of this, on one report it was 99%, is malicious PowerShell. And the reason I point this out is a lot of fileless or living off the land attacks now, instead of placing a malicious file that a lot of anti-malware can detect, they're starting as PowerShell, which might seem legitimate if you don't look closer. Do you know products like WatchGuard EPDR do look closer though? They pay attention to PowerShell with our contextual engine and can see if it's malicious. You will notice on that last slide, only 2% of malware arrives via malicious browsers, but this is basically that slide being looked at in a different way, comparing Q1 to Q2. Essentially, browser-based malware did rise a little bit, as did Office-based malware. The most popular browsers that malware arrives in is still IE, but then Firefox second, and Chrome has been growing, so even Chrome is getting a little bit of malware. The final thing I want to mention before we close off with our final tips is we do have a security story of the month in our Internet Security Report. So if you're interested, I would check it out in the report. This month, we talked about a new word vulnerability that targeted Office-based documents that was being exploited in the wild 0-day. Mark goes into very technical detail on how Follina, which is the name of this document-based threat, worked, and some takeaways for how you can avoid it. So check out our report for that. Final poll question before we get into the last bit of conclusion defense tips. Let's see how many of you offer regular security awareness to your users? So security awareness training. And if you do, are you using a actual platform to deliver it in an automated fashion? Are you making up your own? Do you only do it occasionally? Right now, by the way, October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so it's a good time to do it. Or do you not use it at all? And if anyone is still answering, sorry, I'm going very quickly, but I have a feeling the general stats of the results won't change much. Good news, over half of you use automatic platforms. As you'll see in our defensive tips, we really encourage this. If you don't have an automated platform, custom training and doing it occasionally is okay, it's better than nothing. But you really ought to do security awareness training, and we'll talk about that in a moment with the final defensive summary. So, sorry, just changed in polls. So Trevor, why don't you get the first tip for the final takeaways from this report?
Certainly. So as we discussed, and we need to have inspection on the encrypted traffic. When we take a look at the encrypted traffic versus unencrypted traffic, we do find that most of it is encrypted. And while there are some steps that we need to take, that users need to take to get the encryption traffic inspection working, it is well worth it, because when the consequences of not inspecting this means that we're losing that layer of defense at the perimeter, and then you're only relying on the endpoint to detect that, and hopefully the endpoint will catch it. But that's not, this is part of the best practices, is to have that perimeter inspection at the outside of your network.
Thanks, Trevor. The second one, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because I kind of covered it in our previous Firebox feed tip, but segment high trust networks. This is the secure SCADA tip, but also applied to any company that has high trust things like your Active Directory server, your financial servers, your source code, etc. If you're still using a flat network, you're taking away some of your layered protection you can add between groups internally. And you can't trust the inside completely either, because if one user, even a low privilege user, gets malware on their system, they can then jump around your internal network, and that's why segmenting is so important. And for the poll question, why don't you finish off with the last trip, Trevor?
Sure. So what we want to, as far as our best practices, is to make sure that we train our users. And I'm glad nobody said that they don't believe in benefits of awareness training, because what we see constantly is the most amount of malware, widespread malware, is Office documents. And Office documents are often trying to trick users into enabling macros or allowing their program to run. And if we can train users just simply to not allow that, and to be aware of when you receive an email from somebody else that's maybe you're not aware of, or maybe you are aware of this person, you know that you still want to be suspicious, because they could be infected with malware and be sending out emails. So for example, you want to make sure that you want to train your users to check if you receive documents that are unexpected, and anything that could be suspicious, like a executable or a Office document.
Yeah. Besides, as Trevor said, making sure your users don't enable any active content when they're opening a document. I think the simple tip of letting them know documents can be dangerous. A lot of non-tech savvy users might think, oh, a document is text, it's safe, it's not like an executable. But you guys know that's not true. That's why you don't want to enable the active content in the document. And to Trevor's last point, it's as important to be skeptical of documents you don't expect from people you know. A lot of attacks will already have hacked someone you know, and thus can send email from them, or are spoofing them in some way if you don't have email protections like DMARC enabled. So you can't even trust documents from people you know. The tip you should give them is, if they weren't expecting it, to follow up and ask about it before opening it. That way, and ask via a channel, indirect channel, where you know you're getting to the real person. So sorry we went a bit over, but that is the Internet Security Report for Q2. You can, by the way, find more information about this report at Secplicity. If you go to the threat research section, that's where we store both a dynamic view, where you can actually look up, using the same data we use in the report, different regions. And we also shared this report itself. There's a lot of detail in it you should check out. And there's a lot of other things on that site, like podcasts and stuff like that. I've answered a lot of the questions I've seen real time, so we'll skip that since we're going over. But if there's any we've missed, we can definitely follow up an email. Thank you, Trevor, and thank you, audience, for watching today. I hope you have a great rest of your day and implement some of these defensive strategies.